Welcome back. We're going to be talking about objective personality, and I want to start with a question that I get often, or the most often, which is OP real? And it's a difficult question to answer. Depending on your perspective, you might think the answer is somewhere between yes, no, or even it doesn't matter. Ironically, you can probably learn something about your own OP type depending on how you think about that question. If you're firmly in the intuition end of the spectrum, you might not really care if OP is real, or what its caveats are, or if it has caveats. While if you're on the sensing end of the spectrum, you might care a lot because having some system that isn't proven means that it's not a very useful system. And so I decided to take a look at the history of where this type of psychological analysis comes from. The Victorian era was exciting for a lot of reasons. Science and medicine were starting to get frisky, tackling unsolvable problems such as mental illness. Jean Charcot was a neurologist in the 1800s, and there were lots of people suffering from untreatable conditions with symptoms ranging from anxiety, convulsions, and hallucinations, with no ability to explain or treat what was going on. These symptoms were given labels, some of which have changed a lot since then. Sometimes hysteria was just women getting uppity and men not liking it, but the symptoms associated with it were real and recognized in modern diseases which are very difficult to treat. When Jean was entering the field, brain surgeries, think lobotomy, were the best brain treatments available and worked about as well as you'd imagine, which is to say they did not work at all and caused permanent brain damage. He introduced the idea of using hypnosis as a way of treating these diseases, which worked in some cases and didn't, involve cutting up people's brains, which got people excited. Hypnosis revealed that there was a lot going on in people's minds that even they weren't aware of. No one knew what hypnosis was opening up, but understanding what it was connecting with might make it more effective as a treatment. This is where modern psychology got its roots, trying to understand the world hypnosis was opening up and to make hypnosis and talk therapy more effective at actually treating people. Two of the most famous psychologists in this time period were Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. I think nowadays Freud gets a bad rap and is seen as a crazy person and probably the world's worst scientist. But looking into it, I started to realize that he wasn't crazy and what he was doing actually did make sense from what they knew at the time. Okay, so Freud started making theories to explain what hypnosis was doing. He made a model where the conscious mind was connected with and driven by a subconscious mind called the id, which held deep animalistic desires. The mind is governed by our higher order self called the superego, and the ego and the superego work together to repress undesirable desires. So if a person's mind wasn't healthy, maybe it was because the system was messed up somehow. So he theorized that mental illness came from a bad relationship between the conscious and the subconscious mind. If that was true, maybe you could cure a patient or help treat them by finding out what was unhealthy about their subconscious desires or what was unhealthy with their relationship to their subconscious. And if you could heal that through hypnosis and talk therapy, then maybe you could resolve these different sorts of symptoms that were really ruining people's lives. Freud's models of how the psyche was put together became popular, while his explanations for what was going wrong with our unconscious minds, not so much. I think it's interesting and probably relevant to our future discussions that the theories Freud came up with about how the mind works turned out to match our brains pretty well considering how little they knew. Carl Jung came up with his own theory that patterns in the dreams and subconsciousnesses of his patients matched themes from literature in many cultures, which led to his theory of archetypes. Most of what Jung did came from observing patterns in his patients after decades of talk therapy, including inventing the core cognitive functions. He didn't intend for these functions to be scientific truths, but organizing principles to use when trying to understand relationships.
Certainly then, this whole matter of extremes, introversion, extroversion, as you say, it's sort of a schematic approach to sort of hang an idea on an approach.
Yeah.
But it would be, as you say, ridiculous to say
You
that
see,
people...
my whole scheme of typology is merely a sort of orientation. There is such a factor as introversion. There is such a factor as extroversion. The classification of individuals means nothing at all. This is only the instrumentarium for the practical psychologist to explain, for instance, a husband to a wife or vice versa.
We, of course, know of your concepts of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And, of course, it would be very interesting to hear some expansion of the meaning of these particular terms as related to the introvert-extrovert dichotomy.
The sensation tells you that there is something. Thinking, roughly speaking, tells you what it is. Feeling tells you whether it is agreeable or not, to be accepted or not, accepted or rejected.
Yes.
And intuition, now there is a difficulty.
Yes.
You don't know ordinarily how intuition works. So when a man has a hunch, you can't tell exactly how he got at that hunch or where that hunch comes from. There's something funny about intuition. I will tell you a little story. I had two patients. The man was a sensation type and the woman was an intuitive type. Of course, they felt attraction. And so they took a little boat and went out to the Lake of Zurich. And there were those birds that dive after fish, you know.
Yeah.
And then after a certain time they come up again and you can't tell where they come up. And so they began to bet who was the first to see the bird. Now, you would think that the one who observes reality very carefully, the sensation type, would of course win out.
Yeah.
Not at all. The woman won the bet completely.
Yeah.
She was beating him on all points.
Yeah.
Because by intuition she knew it before.
I see.
See? Now, how is that possible?
Yeah.
Well, sometimes, you know, you can really find out how it works by finding the intermediate links. You see, it is a perception by intermediate links, and you only get the result of that whole chain of associations.
Yes.
So my definition is, intuition is a perception by ways or means of the unconscious.
Yes.
That is as near as I can get.
People really liked the Jungian functions, and eventually they got picked up and used by the mother-daughter pair named Isabel Myers and Catherine Briggs, who came up with the Myers-Briggs testing system. This allowed people to score themselves on these functions and gave people a language to describe how their personality worked in comparison with other people's. And that brings us to the modern day, where Myers and Briggs made a self-assessment written exam that people could take. David and Shannon recognized that self-assessments are biased, so they came up with a more complicated system designed to be used by outside observers, which could be independently checkable. They were able to come up with a system where they felt like they could type someone the same way independently, which meant that those observations were observer independent and therefore must be real and not imagined. What that doesn't mean, as Carl Jung mentioned before, is that these functions are scientifically falsifiable. They're not. They're also not physically measurable. So if they're real, but not physical or provable, then what are they? What is OP? And that's when I realized that OP is a random forest. And I realized that some of you don't know what a random forest is, so we're going to talk about that. So what is a random forest? A random forest is something that allows you to deal with information that is complicated and you don't necessarily know what the answer is, but you have a lot of observations. There are a lot of things that may be meaningful but aren't scientifically falsifiable. So you have something like political boundaries or genres of music or different things about culture, things that people agree on, or you can kind of observe but aren't necessarily specifically well defined. So how do you find meaning without an experiment? The answer comes from data science, which is about figuring out how to extract meaning from data. It is the science of discovering truth through observation. If you're an unscrupulous data scientist, which is most of them, you'll find a way of turning those descriptions into measurements. Except you won't call them measurements, you'll probably call them features. So if you're a data scientist trying to understand music, for example, then you might look at the music and invent some features that you think are useful. The scientific technique that lets you identify which features are most useful is called a random forest. Okay, so how does this work? One of my favorite online personalities, Brene Brown, talks about how when she was a young scientist growing up, she was told that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. So that gives you two types of things that can be measured and things that can be described. we'll ignore other categories for now. Stuff that can be really measured has physical properties like temperature, distance, weight, or other things like that. On the other hand, you have lots of things that can be described, but not necessarily measured objectively. You can have a chair, and there are some things that you like about chairs or things that seem very chair-like, but it's hard to tell exactly how chair-like something is or how much meaning is contained in a painting. Those are difficult to figure out. So let's pretend that you're a data scientist and we're looking at live music. And so you've come up with a list of features, and that list could involve anything like yodeling or leather, guitar, buttons, you name it. Then you go to lots of live concerts and figure out how all of these music shows fare on this feature set. You're going to sort your musical experiences between things that have more zippers and things that have more buttons than zippers. So we sort out all of the music into these two categories, zippers and buttons, and then you can evaluate whether or not this is a good feature set by measuring the dissimilarity between those groups and the similarity within each of those groups. So in this case, we know that the separation between zippers and buttons is a bad random forest split because groups A and B aren't that different, and the examples within group B aren't that similar. That means that zippers and buttons is not a great feature for understanding or separating music. On the other hand, if you're able to find some features like yodels or eyeliner and distortion, then suddenly your split becomes a lot more meaningful. Here, the music inside these two groups is very similar, while the music between those categories is very different. That means this is a good feature set to use in a random forest. I think objective personality passes this test with flying colors. So here you have the standard 128 personality type table that Dave and Shannon use, and you can see that people on this end are much more likely to be introverted because they're sleep first, and these people are much more likely to be extroverted because they're play first. You also have subgroups like these people, they're high consume, self over tribe, and don't mind chaos, and these people are blasty tribe over self individuals who appreciate structure. People who are in similar groups exhibit similar characteristics and are very dissimilar from others. For example, Ken Honda is all the way over here.
So once again, we experience our life according to our beliefs. And some people have better luck than others. And some people work so hard, but they're getting minimum wages. Mm-hmm. So you have to find your place, your seat, your reserved seat is what I call. A lot of people try to sit on other people's seat, which is wrong because your seat is reserved somewhere else.
He's a super introverted person who sees value in strong personal narrative with a lot of structure. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have Jim Carrey.
And click a thingy and go. And you are now alive.
Gentlemen, are we good to go? We're good to go. Perfect.
Is everything okay?
So yeah, he's an extroverted physical chaos monkey. So those guys are on opposite ends of the spectrum, and they feel very different from each other, which is good because they're in very different OP categories. In addition to that, I want to talk about binary coins. One of the things that OP does really well is that it's not just using sliding feature scales like the Big Five does sometimes. It's using a ratio of different mutually exclusive features. It's really hard to imagine how much thinking someone does on a scale of 1 to 10, but it's a lot easier and more reliable to figure out what the ratio of their decision making happens using feelings versus logic and reasoning. This is similar to how engineers handle complex physical relationships. So if you're trying to capture the expression of a complicated system, you'll come up with a non-dimensional parameter. Feeling decisions divided by thinking decisions is an example of a non-dimensional parameter. In fluids, the most famous non-dimensional parameter is the Reynolds number, which is used for lots of things, including making tiny ships look like they're actually huge in movies. You can figure out how big the thing that you're trying to model is, the size of your model, and if it's in water, you can either put a small boat in a very viscous fluid to make it look like it's a big boat, or you can slow down time. And if you use the Reynolds number, it tells you exactly how much you should slow down time to make your teeny tiny 6-inch model look like it's hundreds or thousands of feet long. So let's say that you've got all of your music festivals together and you've made the split and you found all these features split into complex data set into smaller sections that are very similar to each other. So we're good for the similarity within groups and the dissimilarity between groups. You can then start to hypothesize why those groups are so different from each other, the mechanism that drives those differences. This is the type of approach that I used in my postdoc when we were looking at cancer. We looked at cells and graded them on layer organization and disorder or funkiness. And we looked at lots of features. We found that some clusters were more likely to respond to drugs and others were less likely to respond to drugs. We had the benefit of knowing what outcomes we were looking for, but you don't understand the mechanism within the system you're looking at the beginning. You have to infer that by putting all of these features together. Okay, so what does that tell us about personality stuff? So given that you can't test different personalities for their drug responsiveness, is there any way of testing the Jungian functions or tying them to something more tangible or physical? Well, there are some papers that show your Myers-Briggs type impacts your responses to surveys, and there are some differences you can pick up in an fMRI. fMRIs are really cool because they can show you the amount of activity in a particular region of the brain when a person is performing some kind of task. There are statistically significant relationships between self-reported personality metrics and brain activation. How significant? Really insignificant. In general, don't trust anything that says it's statistically significant and doesn't tell you how much, because you can get some really weak relationships that pass the statistically significant threshold. I also found this guy who does some really cool things measuring the differences in EEG voltages as connected with personality types.
Here, you can see the letters are very different. So even if you're not that up to date with the Myers-Briggs terminology, it's absolutely fine. You can tell that just I versus E, N versus S, F versus T, they're pretty different from each other. So I suppose you could say INFPs are really good at coming up with reasons and explanations and making long-term life decisions that revolve around their personal identity and values. And they're very good at listening and working with words, whether those are literal words and composition and word choice. And so right there, we can just see by these red regions here that I've given you some idea of the analytical skills of ESTP.
But you have to be careful because EEG data is notoriously bad, which is probably why I wasn't able to find many publications from Dario Nardi. Not because his work is bad, but I'm guessing because the EEG data is noisy and inconsistent and doesn't replicate well. So is OP real? If you're super focused on things having a tangible physical nature, then no, it's not scientifically falsifiable, it's not physically measurable, and it's not based on physical mechanism. On the other hand, you might conclude that we don't know yet because we don't have the tools necessary to understand how the brain works, and maybe that's a good thing. On the other hand, you might decide that OP is real because this is coming from independent observations, which means that they are observing something outside of themselves, and it's derived using scientific methods. So it's not necessarily scientifically falsifiable, but a random forest is a way of parsing and organizing information and lots of observations in a way that let you intuit what the mechanisms might be. And if you come up with categories that are very strongly different from each other, then that's meaningful. Or you might conclude that it really doesn't matter whether or not it's real or not because it's useful. Lots of things that are real, like culture or love or classical music, can't be scientifically falsifiably proven, but they're still meaningful and they teach you a lot of things that are helpful in life. I found objective personality is the best way to communicate with other people about nuanced differences between our personalities and really get at differences in the way that people observe things and experience the world. So it's the best tool for intelligent empathy that I've found so far. So here's some parting questions, just things to think about. Is Canada scientifically real? Can you prove that you love someone? And if there's a brain region that was active and could be correlated exclusively with a Myers-Briggs or OP type, would that change your understanding of what Myers-Briggs or OP personality analysis is? Thanks.